Was it just someone else that you saw?
I believe it was his mom who was wearing a baseball cap. They had returned from the park with that Mustang. So who does that, right? Like, if you think your son's missing since Tuesday, you're going to bring his car back to the home. So it didn't make sense that anyone would do that if he wasn't there. So the individual getting out with a baseball cap we thought was Brian.
Hey guys, it's Katie from Without a Crystal Ball. Welcome back to my channel. Welcome back to my life. Now let's talk for a second because there has been some new developments in the Brian Laundrie, Gabby Petito case. And there has been a lot of news that has been pushed out to the media, and there's been a lot of information. We talked about a lot of the interviews that Mr. Bertolino was having with the media about various aspects of the days leading up to Brian Laundrie leaving.
Chris and Roberta knew that their son Brian was grieving. They knew he was so upset, and they just couldn't control that he was leaving, and he left. He walked out the door, and Chris has said to me, "I wish I could have stopped him, but I couldn't."
And then there was the remains that were found. Now there's been an autopsy. I will say this about this case is that throughout the entirety of this case, there's always been a lot of misinformation surrounding this case. There's been a lot of conspiracy theorists that have in many ways taken over the case and made everything more confusing than it probably needs to be. And today was like no other. So a statement made by Stephen Bertolino today said that the autopsy for Brian Laundrie was inconclusive. So it was inconclusive in that they did not know how he passed. So they don't know the cause or the manner. The remains that were found were very fractured and there was not a whole body. And so obviously that proved challenging. And on top of it, it was skeletal. So there was difficulty in them figuring out how his life ended. The body was positively confirmed last week, and they confirmed it via dental records. Now there's a lot of questions about how did they get the dental records so fast. The FBI had been to the Laundrie's house weeks before, they'd been to the Laundrie's house weeks before, and they were looking for DNA for matching and to search for Brian. So obviously they were providing information to the FBI to help with tracking whether it was finding him alive or gone. When they positively identified him by dental records, the FBI put out a statement and said that Brian's remains had been positively identified, and that was really all they had to say at that time. So a statement stating that it was inconclusive has somehow turned into the remains are now inconclusive, which is not the case. The FBI said that they were identified positively. The family's been notified by dental records. Dental records are a standard means of identifying bodies. And now the remains are being sent to an anthropologist, according to Stephen Bertolino. And the anthropologist is going to be trying to further test the body. There will be DNA testing, and there will also be different testing to just take a look at the remains to see how or what happened to Brian. So people somehow have taken an inconclusive, we don't know how he passed, to inconclusive for DNA, which is literally not what was ever said. And the DNA part is that the anthropologist is going to be doing DNA testing. When you only have like a portion of the body and their skeletons, it's going to be hard to figure out how something happened, what happened. We just know that he's gone. But it doesn't stop people from believing that he's not, and he's alive, and he's like he's still on the Appalachian Trail. I think some people are struggling with the end of this story. They're struggling with the idea that this case isn't going to be what they thought it was. They're struggling with the fact that they're never going to see Brian get justice. They would rather believe in conspiracy theories than actually with the reality that Brian is gone, Gabby is gone, and there's not going to be all the answers that we want. There's also been a lot of mistakes that have been made by the police, which has not helped this. And there's been a lot of not a lot of questions from the FBI, which has also not helped this. And then there's been Stephen Bertolino's inconsistent stories and changing the narrative and making statements where he says that Brian is grieving, but it's days before the body's found, and he's misspeaking constantly, and he's yelling at the media about everything. And then
questions here. You know, you told us that Laundrie's knew Brian was grieving the night he left. Trevor just reported that. That was on September 13th. But Gabby Petito's remains weren't discovered until the 19th. So why did they think he was grieving?
Brian had been extremely upset. Chris and Roberta were very concerned about him. They expressed that to me, that when he walked out the door that evening, they wish they could have stopped him. They wish they could have prevented him from going out, but he was intent on leaving. And Chris said to me, in hindsight, I know I couldn't stop him.
Add in the grifters that are protesting outside of the Laundrie's house, and these grifters all have shady records, shady backgrounds. This whole situation became a circus, is still a circus, and unfortunately, Brian's gone, Gabby's gone, and we're still having arguments about whether or not Brian's alive. So tonight, the police in Northport admit that they made a mistake. And this is what the mistake is that they claim. Back on September 16th, the sheriff in Northport said in a press conference that Brian Laundrie, they knew exactly where he was, but they were not going to tell anyone where Brian was. But they said they knew where Brian was.
Right now, no. Right now, all we have is the missing person investigation on that.
Okay.
Really simple question. You said you knew where Brian is. Is he at his parents' house?
All I'm gonna say is I know where Brian's at.
All right. Thank you,
guys.
everyone. You can certainly follow up with us, me.
We know now that Brian was not at home, and he was likely not alive when the sheriff said that he knew where Brian was, because on the 16th, his family did not know where Brian was. His attorney did not know where Brian was. Well, today, Josh Taylor says that they made a mistake and they thought Brian was coming home in the Mustang, but it was really Roberta.
We thought that we'd seen Brian initially come back into that home on that Wednesday.
Was it just someone else that you saw?
I believe it was his mom who was wearing a baseball cap. They had returned from the park with that Mustang.
This is actually a lot to unpack, and now I can understand a little bit why people are like annoyed with Northport. But here's the thing: Northport's only one investigating partner in this. It's an FBI-led investigation. But they said, and mind you, this is before her remains are found. This is before there's a huge, and this is really before the FBI has taken over at this point. So they say on the day, I think of the 15th, the Mustang comes home. And they believe they see Brian walking into the house from the Mustang, but instead it was actually Roberta coming inside in the Mustang, and Roberta had on a hat. So somehow they mistook a 5'8", 23-year-old boy, man-ish, to like a woman in her 50s that has hair. Brian's bald, and she's quite a bit, Brian's slim, and she's more curvy. I really don't think they look anything alike, but maybe it was dark. Maybe they weren't looking very well. But of course, now this mistake has thrown everything into chaos again. And so people are starting to question all aspects of this case. I believe there was a lot of mistakes made in this case, and I believe that Northport was in over their head. I don't think that Northport is a very large community, and I also don't believe that their police department deals with a lot of cases like this. I don't know how you would mistake a 55 or however old Roberta is to a 23-year-old man. She's curvy, she's voluptuously curvy, if you know what I'm saying, and he's a stick figure guy. So bald, hair, he's taller than her. That doesn't change the fact that her remains were found in Wyoming and his were found at the reserve. So did they make mistakes? Yes. Is it a really big mistake to believe that Roberta is Brian? Yes. But I thought even the worst thing in this is that they said they saw Brian leave in the Mustang. So if you say that you saw Brian leave in the Mustang, why didn't you follow Brian to the park? Did you follow Brian to the park? Did you walk into the park with Brian? Why did they know that Brian left? Why did they see Brian leave? And then why did they think they saw Brian come home? Why weren't they following Brian? Did they follow Brian? Everyone wants to know how Brian got away from this. How did he get out from under the lurking eyes of the Northport? Because they've admitted now through, well, they haven't admitted, but Brian Ensign posted photos on Twitter that they put up surveillance of that they had multiple video cameras around the neighborhood of surveillance. So they had video cameras that they were watching the Laundrie's home. They're watching the Laundrie's home. They say they see Brian leave, but then how did they not follow Brian? And then once the Mustang comes home, how do you think it's Brian and you don't think it's Roberta? Josh Taylor's explanation here is that it's weird that Roberta would pick up the Mustang at the park if she believed that he was there and missing.
Who was wearing a baseball cap. They had returned from the park with that Mustang. So who does that, right? Like, if you think your son's missing since Tuesday, you're going to bring his car back to the home. So it didn't make sense that anyone would do that if he wasn't there. So the individual getting out with a baseball cap we thought was Brian.
But Northport had placed a ticket on the Mustang that said, if you don't move it, we're going to tow your car and impound it. I'm guessing when they went back and they saw that there was a ticket, well, a notice on the car that they were going to tow it, they probably picked up the car and took it home. And then there's the fact that there's all these police reports that are completely redacted. WFLA got a copy of the missing persons report because that whole missing persons thing is like all up in an air too, because Bertolino says that he reported him missing to the FBI. Northport says they didn't find out that Brian was missing until the 17th. And now they've released the missing persons report, and it's all it has is the address and the phone number. Literally, that's it. Nothing else. They've redacted every single thing. Every police report at that address is heavily redacted. So it's like the trust that people have in this police department has made it impossible for them to believe that remains found are actually Brian. And they will cling to words like DNA inconclusive and combine them together to say the DNA was inconclusive, which is not what they said. And it wasn't Northport that confirmed, it was FBI. I'm at a loss here. I'm actually at a loss. I know people are angry. They want to place blame. They want to say that it was Brian never should have been able to get away. Brian never should have been able to take off. I think there was a lot of mistakes made by the Northport PD. I think this case was a circus made by conspiracy theorists, grifters, and fraudsters that are protesting outside the house, people constantly inserting themselves into the case. And then it doesn't help when one of the big pieces that everyone's been asking about is they said they saw Brian and they knew where he was, and now they're admitting we didn't know it was Brian and we made a mistake. It makes every single thing that they've done now seem like, what else did they get wrong? Which is now making people like, well, if they got this wrong, did they get the remains right? I believe it's Brian. I don't believe the FBI would identify a body without 100% certainty. So I think it's Brian, but I still think there's a lot more questions than answers in this case. And I don't know where it's going to go from here. But I do think that if you're struggling with the finality of this case, instead of diving into conspiracy theories, just take a deep breath, try to stay in reality, and try to stay out of that mindset that he's on an island with Tupac. All right, you guys, tell me what your thoughts are in the comments below. Bye, guys.